The situation in Gaza remains perilous, and these are words that are likely to be spoken for many, many more months to come. Why is that? Well, the United States and Israel continue to play footsie with each other as Israel uh, refuses to relent on its ongoing campaign, so-called military operation, which many have called a genocide. And this genocide has caused so many problems for Israel, for the world, for the United States, and they have mounted and piled up, whether we're talking about the regional situation with Hezbollah clearing the so-called north of Israel, where there are clashes between Hezbollah and Israeli forces every single day, some of them incredibly deadly, whether it's Yemen and the Ansar Allah movement wreaking havoc on the Red Sea, sinking ships, now reaching, I believe, the Mediterranean Sea with its blockade campaign, or whether we're talking about regionally, or whether we are talking about inside of the collective West, in particular the United States, with massive student protests, which have led to immense repression from, unironically, police forces in the United States, many of whom have received direct training from Israeli forces, the IDF itself. So what we now have is an attempt as Israel. Now, a lot of people have problems with the overall position of this channel being that Israel is actually losing this war, that Palestinian resistance have mounted a really resilient and heroic fight back against this onslaught. And while the casualties are immense, Rafah is now getting hit. There's going to be a direct invasion, a full-scale one likely by Israeli forces soon. But Rafah is already getting hit. It's already getting bombarded. I believe children and women have already been killed there, on top of the tens of thousands that have already been killed. But nonetheless, Israel is not winning this war because Palestinian resistance is not going away. They are taking a more and more concerted, stern, and a powerful position in negotiations. They are the ones who are really having the leverage worldwide. Why? Because the world stands with them. That is what these student protests especially have represented, is that now in the collective West, what thin bubble and barrier existed between this massive popular resentment and opposition to Israel, the Biden administration, the collective West's wanton support of Israel, now that is beginning to burst completely and entirely, to the point where the United States media, the neocons, are desperate. So they're just coming out with they're just throwing everything out here. The New York Times had the most egregious example of this, talking about how Russia, China, and Iran are using fuel from the campus protests to exploit a U.S. divide. America's adversaries have mounted online campaigns to amplify the social and political conflicts over Gaza, flaring at universities, researchers say. So, mind you, here you have the New York Times spending an enormous amount of energy on so-called fake online activity from so-called Russia, disinformation operations, China, Iran. And as you read this, and we're not going to read the whole thing because there's a lot to get to here, and there's a broader point as to why the United States is delaying any kind of assertion of any leverage over Israel. The point here is that whenever something is not going well with the United States, whenever it is both in need of escalating tensions and war, which it has done with Russia, China, and Iran all across the board, especially in recent period with Iran and Russia. So they're saying that they have talked to these social media outlets. So they said Meta has linked Russia's information operations, attributing clashes unfolding on American college campuses to the failures of the Biden administration. A newspaper controlled by the Communist Party of China said police crackdowns expose the double standards and hypocrisy in the United States when it comes to free speech. On X, a spokesperson for Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Nasser Kanani, posted a cartoon of the police arresting a younger protester in the guise of the Statue of Liberty. Quote, imprisonment of hashtag freedom in the USA, end quote, he wrote. As protests over the war in Gaza have spread across the U.S., Russia, China, and Iran have seized on them to score geopolitical points abroad and sow tensions within the U.S., according to researchers who identified both overt and covert efforts by the countries to amplify the protests since they started. But they say, they can't. They say the Black Lives Matter protests were directed by Russia in some degree directly in 2016 and 2020. They haven't found that, they said. But it's Russia and Iran and China, which are portraying the United States as being utterly divided and under social and political turmoil, producing nearly 400 articles in English about these protests. So, what they are saying here, and I'm not going to read any more because it is absolute drivel. It is literally just a study in how stupid they think you are, how stupid the neocons think we all are. What they are saying is that just because Russia, China, and Iran are seizing on the truth, that somehow that makes them a party to influence operations. They are literally just saying what is happening and giving their opinions as if the United States has a monopoly, as if the neocons, as if the collective West has a monopoly on public opinion, on world opinion, on what it means to express opinion. Countries have the right, anyone has the right to say, wow, if something is not going well, if something looks hypocritical, if something looks incredibly brutal, if something is oppressive and repressive, well, I think I don't know. It seems to me that it is okay to express opinions on this. This is just something that world leaders have the right, human beings across the board, regardless of your position, you have the right to express your opinion. It just so happens that Iran, China, and Russia have a big platform, especially with the global South, to express these opinions and have them be disseminated. And yeah, guess what? A lot more people are also listening to the Russian position, the Iranian position, and the Chinese position a lot more these days. And a big reason for that is not because Russia, China, and Iran are nefariously trying to undermine the political independence of Americans. They're trying to take over and co-opt their political systems so that Americans will do their bidding. No, it's just that the United States and the collective West and the neocons have moved so far into a position of conflict with these countries that they have amplified the risk of war 10, 15, 20 fold, that how can anyone who's paying attention not be curious about what the other side is saying? Because all we get is the United States, the collective West, and the neocon mindset and framework over these issues. So really, it is just a total case of not just hypocrisy, not just projection, but of a failed policy of aggression, which is backfiring dramatically. And why is it backfiring, you might ask? What do you mean by backfiring? Well, a few things. The fact is, all right, we just have to look at the facts of the situation. The fact is that what's happening on college campuses is incredibly brutal. It is shocking for a lot of people, especially around the world, who hear the United States talk about democracy, they talk about democracy, they talk about the United States being the best democracy in the world, the most exceptional country, being a paragon of exceptionalism. Well, then they see images like this and they might think differently.
They're scared of fucking books.
How you feel, officer? We're scared of education. You're a big man now, huh?
So that was just one example. on UCLA's campus of what has happened to these encampments. And I was at some at the City College of New York and NYU, and I was bopping around New York, and it was all the same. It was massive police presences, essentially looking to tie up and arrest en masse protesters, students, professors. It didn't matter. It was a complete, and it has been a complete and utter example of the hypocrisy of so-called free speech in the United States. You have free speech as long as you're not criticizing Israel, and as long as you're not taking action that is pressuring an end to a policy that you believe is inhumane and genocidal when it comes to Israel. If this were Russia, if these students were camping out and saying, we want Russia to stop its military operation against Ukraine, do we think that the police would have any problems? Do we think that the media would be coming after them as being dupes of Russia and China? I don't think so. I think that they would be completely supported, that they would be given institutional support. Heck, we would know the leaders of these protests by name. We would know the organizations by name. We would be hearing and seeing them every single day as heroes of democracy, as they would be getting National Endowment for Democracy funding, and they would be seen as this new age of American exceptionalism and Western exceptionalism against so-called authoritarianism. That's what would be happening. But of course, that this is something different. This is something different entirely. And this is why geopolitics always, it doesn't matter that this is supposedly a domestic issue. It's not. These students stood up against genocide, against what's happening in Gaza. They are being punished for it by the domestic forces of repression, U.S. police departments, those like in New York, which have been trained directly by the IDF in so-called counter-terror operations. But not only this, it's that these protests have also been about a deteriorating situation for the U.S.'s global standing as a whole. This is about the continued erosion of U.S. hegemony vis-a-vis the rising multipolar world. Now, the students may not know this directly. Some of them probably do. Some of them don't. People who are paying attention to these protests, wherever side of the political line you're on, you may not understand the global implications of what it means for the collective West and people within it, especially in the United States, to move further and further on the side of Palestine. It's about a lot more than just people being sympathetic about an atrocity, which is it's an atrocity. There are hundreds of Palestinians still being imprisoned and killed per day, every single day in the United States. I believe just paused one arms shipment. It's unclear why, but it doesn't even matter because the United States continues to fuel, to escalate, and to really coordinate. We have to be honest here. The United States isn't just arming, it isn't just aiding, it is helping Israel coordinate these. How could it not? The United States is a major occupant. It is the major force in the region. Israel can't do anything, not even to Gaza, without the United States knowing a whole lot about it and weighing in. We have to be quite honest about that. We have to be sober about this. Nonetheless, this is still about the United States' waning position, and it's not just about the Middle East, but the Middle East is now back on the agenda, and now there's desperation setting in to the point where not only does the United States feel like it needs to demonize students, many of whom are just for the first time becoming politically engaged or probably know very little about geopolitics and the world situation, but they feel compelled, the United States' political class, the neocons of foreign policy establishment, to label them dupes of Russia, of China, of Iran, And in many ways, this is because the United States has ulterior motives. Okay. So this is what Bloomberg was reporting early in May as talks across the board were happening. The Biden administration has been on what you could call a charm offensive, as they say, about China. Really, the United States has been trying to conduct such an offensive amid this domestic turmoil and amid really what is global turmoil, which is a huge shift away from the US's pole and sphere of influence. People are sick of the United States' way of handling and ruling the world order. So now what is the United States trying to do? It is trying to, one, demonize these protests because it is trying to push through a foreign policy achievement for the Biden administration before the election. And the Ukraine aid package is not enough. That is a nothing burger. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't move the needle. The Middle East, everyone's eyes are on Gaza. Everyone's eyes are on the situation. And what does the Biden administration want to do? Does he want to end the genocide? Nope. No, not at all. That is not what's on the table. Blinken and, of course, other representatives of the so-called State Department are a party to the Cairo talks for a so-called ceasefire, which doesn't look like it's on its way anytime soon because of Israel's intransigence. But the United States is focusing on something completely different, which is normalization. Once again, we are back to the Abraham Accords. We are back to the United States trying to resurrect something that was killed because of October 7th, because of how Israel reacted to essentially Palestine's prison break. Saudi Arabia at that time could no longer politically be seen as anywhere close to Israel on a diplomatic front, and had to drop the notion that it would normalize relations with Israel. But now the United States is trying to push it through. Sullivan says the U.S.-Saudi defense pact not possible without Israel deal. So this defense pact, right, between the United States and Israel was supposed to be a huge middle finger to China, to the rest of the Middle East, to the Iran normalization situation, right? It was supposed to be that Saudi Arabia and the United States firm up their defense ties, which means that Saudi Arabia would be more of a bulwark and would be more in opposition to Iran, despite their normalization talks in Beijing with Iran last year. And that Saudi Arabia would also be, on the fast track to moving itself away from BRICS, from Russia, from China, and toward the United States. Now, here's what Bloomberg had to say in their report, because now we're seeing exactly why the United States feels so compelled to delegitimize everything about these protests, to drag their feet about a ceasefire. It's because they are more concerned about getting back to the status quo for the United States, for the U.S. empire. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan insisted the Biden administration will enter into a defense pact with Saudi Arabia only if the kingdom normalizes relations with Israel. Sullivan said in an interview with the newspaper the two issues are part of an integrated vision for peace in the Middle East and could not be disentangled. He said that President Joe Biden will publicly outline a path to a more secure Israel and a more peaceful region in the months ahead. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia are nearing a historic pact that would offer the kingdom security guarantees and lay out a possible way to normalize diplomatic ties with Israel if its government brings the war in Gaza to an end, Bloomberg reported this week, citing people familiar with the matter. The agreement faces obstacles, but would amount to a new version of a framework that was scuttled when Hamas militants attacked Israel on October 7th, triggering the conflict in Gaza. Separately, the Financial Times cited Sullivan as saying that the U.S. military aid will help Ukraine stop further gains, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's all about Russia. But this was just a report on this possible deal. Now, of course, in there you saw, what did it say? It says here, if its government brings the war in Gaza to an end. All right. So that's the big disappointment there for the United States, is that Israel is not bringing this to an end. They have shown absolutely no interest in bringing this conflict to an end, in bringing its genocide to an end, and thus this whole normalization talk feels pretty useless. But the point here is that the United States is not, the neocons, the foreign policy establishment, they're not focusing on what the vast majority of people around the world want, which is a real uh, a real ceasing of the hostilities. They want Israel to stop. Even the United States cannot publicly support a invasion of Rafah, for example. But the United States has been absolutely a huge reason why a ceasefire has not been reached, why Israel is able to continue to assert what looks like unending leverage against the United States. And in many cases, you could say Israel does have a lot of leverage over the United States. The United States really needs Israel, even if Israel doesn't control the United States. The United States' need for Israel is so great that Israel feels like it has the ability to assert its interests over the United States. That is why AIPAC has such firm control over U.S. politics. It's not because there's a Jewish conspiracy. It's not because the Zionists are more powerful than the neocons, or in many cases, they overlap greatly. But it's not because Zionists are in control. It's not Israelis that are in control of the U.S. government. In fact, what has happened is that the United States has needed so much control over the Middle East as a whole that without Israel, the United States feels as if its position in that region goes up in smoke. And so that means, regardless of whether Biden or Blinken or anyone else likes or agrees with what Israel is doing, they have to go along with it, because if they should take any consequential action against Israel, well, what else does the United States really have in this region? Nothing. The rest of the region would go up in smoke, fall like a house of cards. The multipolar world would be strengthened multifold, because even countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., well, of course, they in many ways betray the interests of the region, of the people, and of course, Palestine. They themselves are feeling massive pressure to move in a different direction, which is why the United States is focusing on trying to normalize ties with Israel. It's a big deal. The security pact, normalization of ties with Israel. It's about reconfiguring the Middle East to pull it away from Russia, to pull it away from China, to pull it away from multipolarity, and to destroy any hope for the Palestinian people. It is all connected. That is what this is all about. That's why the student protesters have to be called agents of Russia, agents of China, agents of Iran. It's why the United States can never seem to focus on any one particular matter in the Middle East. It never can seem to focus on the immediate task at hand, because there is no immediate task at hand for the United States and for the foreign policy establishment. Gaza is simply a sacrifice. Palestinians have always been that people that have needed to be, for U.S. hegemony and U.S. interests, have needed to be in a state of complete and utter squalor, dispossessed of their self-determination ever since the United States became powerful enough after the 67 war that Israel so-called won, but really it was the downfall of Arab nationalism and unity in that region that essentially gave gave Israel that victory. But ever since then, the United States, because it came out of this position, this desperate position, really after not World War II, the Vietnam War, but it came out of that still the most powerful country in the world, and only growing because the alternative to U.S. empire was also weakening, the Soviet Union, etc. So all of that is to say is that the Palestinian people have always been to the United States foreign policy establishment nothing more than sacrificial lambs for their hegemony, and they need to be in that position in order for Israel to exist as it does, and for Israel to serve U.S. foreign policy interests as it does. Why do you think the British Empire supported Israel, supported the formation of Israel? It wasn't because they just loved. Of course, there was an ideological component. Yes, there are many of the British elite who sponsored Israel and began to give huge support after the Balfour Declaration. Indeed, supported Zionism and believed it to be a worthwhile and supportable project, one that had ideological advantages and similarities to the British way of thinking about the world. But that only gets to a fraction of what it was really all about. It was about the British Empire feeling like its empire was going down the drain in this region and that it wanted a foothold forever and was willing to sponsor one of the most evil regimes ever to exist on the face of the earth in order to maintain that. And of course, it only got supplanted by the United States not too long afterward. So that is the story of Israel. Israel really is a story of U.S. foreign policy interests and the policy interests of empires, Western empires. And now Israel has its own vision to become its own kind of empire. That's why its foreign policy objectives don't merely include Palestine and Palestinian people. It's not just about eradicating all of Palestine and going from the river to the sea, as the Likud party's constitution says. It's not just about that, but it's about going even further than that. And now I want to just show you how, while the Biden administration and the neocons try to talk about and delegitimize these protests as some kind of aberration, as some kind of foreign manipulated activity and operation from their adversaries. The truth of the matter is that the geopolitical situation is starting to backfire big time, to the point where even liberal establishment, neocon really establishment outlets like the Atlantic say, when voters care about foreign policy, generally they don't. But for Biden, Gaza could make the election different. I mean, this is something you don't really get. It is true. The United States is not really dictated by foreign policy interests. If anyone was around in 2004, and was paying attention to politics in 2004, the Bush administration was racked by massive protests during the Iraq War. But Bush won anyway. Bush won the election anyway. So, he became a two-term president anyway, because foreign policy just wasn't driving voter opinion, and voters in the United States tend to be quite frank, historically, narrow in their outlook in many ways, because the United States politically is very narrow, and this is by design. So Joe Biden has an Israel problem, says the Atlantic. According to recent polls, more than half, in as much as 2/3 of Americans, disapprove of how he's handled the conflict in Gaza. In a February primary in Michigan, more than 100,000 Democrat voters put uncommitted after critics urged voters to protest his Israel policies. Democratic donors have warned the president that his support for the Israeli operation could cost him in November's election. Will it? Most academics and pollsters tend to be skeptical that foreign policy can swing elections. Americans almost always care more about domestic issues than international ones. Their views on foreign events tend to be weakly held and malleable. Voters will typically align them to match those of their party or their favorite candidates. Their opinions may be more solid when American lives are at stake, but that's not the case in Gaza. But this year may be different, or maybe Israel is different, because even academics and pollsters are saying that the war in Gaza could be electorally significant in 2024 in a way other international issues, including Ukraine, probably won't be. I think Gaza could matter for a number of reasons, said political scientist at UC Irvine. The war, he explained, had produced a powerful brew of political forces, all which bode ill for the Democratic Party. It is a divisive issue within the party, which is home to both dedicated pro-Palestine constituencies and pro-Israel ones. It's prominent enough across news platforms and social media that people are thinking about the conflict when they focus on current affairs and politics. For younger progressives, protesting against Israel has become part of a fight for social justice. To them, the Palestinian cause is tied up to such issues as racial discrimination. The war in Gaza has also helped create a perception that Biden is hapless. The conflict is a humanitarian catastrophe that the White House has been unable to stop, leaving millions of Americans frustrated with the president. It compounds perceptions the United States is losing its international position. A majority of American voters now have poor estimation of Washington's global standing under Biden's leadership. So there you have it. Okay, there you have it. Joe Biden just won enough votes electorally last time around to beat the incumbent Donald Trump. And now in key states where there's major constituencies that have likely relationships to Palestine in some ways, major Arab, for example, populations in the state of Michigan, Muslim practicing populations in the Midwest, those are likely not to go well for Joe Biden this time around. So there's electoral reasons for this, but the geopolitical and the electoral are very connected now in ways that we have not foreseen. And that's because the United States' global standing is diminishing. That's because the multipolar world is rising. It's because not only has the United States found itself completely just caught up in a quagmire in Ukraine, but it also has found itself looking as if it has absolutely no capacity to tap into whatever alignment, right? Whatever alignment existed between the political class and these so-called values of American exceptionalism and democracy and freedom and all of this nonsense, which I on this channel have been talking about as being smokescreens for empire for many years. Now it is being exposed up front for everyone to see, including those who are completely new to politics and who have seen the horrors in Gaza for the first time, these kind of horrors for the first time in their lives. They're witnessing a genocide of a generation, and it is not boding well. So the Biden administration, through all of this, through the horrific PR, that is coming out of these protests for the Biden administration. You have cops just brutalizing young students, many of whom are just sitting in a tent or just passing out literature or just supposedly trespassing on property that they're probably paying $50,000 a year to attend anyway. They're being mass arrested. They are being brutalized, in some ways being shot at. There's just really just damning footage coming out on these things. But not only this, but you have the genocide happening in Gaza. I think it's great that a lot of these students have said, don't take your eyes off Gaza. Well, this is still happening there. The regional conflagration, the conflict amongst the axis of resistance and the United States continues to loom. And what is the United States doing? What is the foreign policy establishment doing? It is attempting to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Why? Because that's what the United States wanted to do before October 7th. It wants to move on. That's what the United States is basically telling the world, that it wants to move on. It wants to get back to its own priorities, that at this moment, its priorities are to find any possible way to include Russia, to include China, to include Iran, to include geopolitical matters into its domestic affairs, because that's most important, is to keep the empire, to keep the empire's propaganda going. And then another priority is to try to get its top allies in the region, its most brutal allies historically, and one of whom, Saudi Arabia, which has been increasingly looking for a more diverse international portfolio, a more diverse relationship with the world, to move Saudi Arabia back into the U.S. orbit by normalizing with Israel and essentially putting the nail in the coffin for Palestine indefinitely, because that will make Israel a permanent feature politically as it currently is constituted. And that means the United States' position in the Middle East will be permanently permanently held for, at least in its opinion, it's permanently for as long. That's not how it's going to go, but that is how the United States foreign policy establishment is looking at this. And it is incredibly reckless. It's incredibly dangerous. And it is something that I think teaches us all a profound lesson about geopolitics. When there is a war to be had, when there is an empire to maintain, when there is hegemony at stake, you can bet on the U.S. foreign policy establishment in using all of its tools of information warfare, of proxy warfare, of direct intervention, all of the tools at its disposal to um, to pursue its narrow, selfish, self-serving interests. And that is what we are seeing here. And that is why we are in desperate need of a new world order where countries like Russia, China, Iran, as well as the rest of the global south, have a more commanding position, have a position that is equal to the weight of their actual relationship and influence on world affairs is, meaning that they deserve to be represented, they deserve to have self-determination, they deserve to have the ability to construct a different way of life. If that is what the people, if that is what the nations of the global south truly want, and indeed we are already seeing that happen, and we are seeing how Gaza has basically changed the calculus of everything, has created a huge problem for the U.S. empire, and it's one that's not going away, and it's one that eventually is going to lead to what we're already seeing: more unrest domestically, more a bigger shift toward a multipolar world, and of course, what that means is a major confrontation on the world stage where the empire, the American empire, the neocons are going to attempt to use one of its flanks and fronts of warfare to escalate and to try to drag the world into another permanent conflict, which of course will be unwinnable, but that's not the point anyway. The point is to keep the chaos going, to keep the profits rolling, and to keep the empire as sturdy as it can be. The problem is that the more that it goes about this route, this is the contradiction, the more that it goes about this path, actually, the more that it backfires and the more unstable it is becoming. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHyphoong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.